My beloved child, something quietly changed the moment your soulmate stopped looking at your son through everyone else's assumptions and finally looked at him with their own eyes. It was not a dramatic confession. It was not some shocking secret suddenly falling into the open. It was smaller than that, and somehow far more meaningful. A pause that lasted a little too long. A name your son refused to explain. A moment when someone nearby made an innocent remark, and instead of answering, he simply lowered his eyes as though protecting a thought he had carried alone for much longer than anyone realized. That was when your soulmate understood the first piece of this story. Your son had been hiding something, yes, but not what everyone believed. And what makes this so important is that the truth was never really about what he was keeping hidden. It was about who he had been trying to protect. Stay with this, because the person your soulmate eventually connected to your son was not someone they expected at all, and even after discovering who it was, one question remained unanswered, the question that may explain everything. Why? There had been little signs for some time, though nobody had known how to arrange them into anything meaningful. Your son would sometimes become unusually quiet when certain conversations began. He would change the subject whenever one particular situation was mentioned. There were messages he seemed reluctant to discuss, moments when he appeared to know more than he was saying, and strange little instances where he would defend someone without ever explaining why that person mattered enough to defend. To everyone watching from the outside, it looked like secrecy. To your soulmate, at first, it looked the same way. But then came a detail so simple that almost anyone could have missed it. Your son was never nervous when questions were directed toward himself. He became guarded only when those questions came close to someone else. Think about that for a moment. If he were protecting his own secret, why did he seem calm whenever attention remained on him? Why did his expression only change when another person's name entered the room? That realization stayed with your soulmate long after the conversation ended. Something did not fit. And when something refuses to fit, sometimes the answer is not hidden deeper. It is sitting right beside the story everyone has already decided to believe. Your soulmate began remembering earlier moments differently. A conversation from weeks ago. A small disagreement that seemed unimportant at the time. Your son had accepted blame for something surprisingly quickly. Nobody questioned it because there was no reason to. But now your soulmate remembered another person had been there too. Someone who had barely spoken. Someone your son had glanced toward only once. It had been such a brief look that nobody gave it meaning then. Yet suddenly that look felt different. Not romantic. Not suspicious. Not dramatic. Protective. Almost as though he had silently decided, let them think this was me. Don't skip this part, because the person he was protecting was closer to the situation than your soulmate first understood. And once that connection became visible, dozens of tiny moments began rearranging themselves. Your son had not been withdrawing from the family. He had been carefully stepping between someone and a truth he believed they were not ready to carry publicly. That does not mean every choice he made was perfect. It does not mean silence was necessarily the best answer. It means his silence had a reason behind it, and that reason appeared to come from care rather than deception. There is a difference between hiding something because you fear being discovered and holding something quietly because you believe another person deserves the chance to speak in their own time. Your soulmate started seeing that difference. And once they saw it, their entire interpretation of your son changed. Suddenly his unusual behavior no longer looked like distance. It looked like loyalty. His short answers no longer sounded evasive. They sounded measured. Even those moments when he had walked away from certain conversations seemed less like avoidance and more like restraint. Something important is waiting for you here, because your soulmate did not learn the identity of the person through confrontation. They discovered it through kindness. One ordinary moment opened the door. Someone was speaking casually about a situation everyone thought had already been settled when your son interrupted, not loudly, not angrily, just firmly enough to make the room become still. You don't know everything they were dealing with. That was all he said. But your soulmate noticed the word he chose. They. Not me. Not us. They. It was the first accidental crack in the wall he had built around the truth. And your soulmate remembered the name that had appeared around every unexplained moment. A person who had been present at the beginning of the misunderstanding. Someone whose connection to you had seemed almost too ordinary to examine closely. Someone who, for reasons nobody yet understood, your son had repeatedly shielded from questions. Your soulmate began paying attention, not spying, not pushing, simply noticing. Then another detail surfaced. There had been a conversation your son believed nobody overheard. His voice was low, gentle, reassuring. You don't have to tell them yet. I won't say anything until you're ready. Your soulmate did not hear the response. They did not need to. Those words were enough to confirm what had slowly been becoming clear. Your son was not protecting himself. He was keeping someone else's confidence. And when your soulmate finally realized who stood on the other side of that promise, they went quiet. Because this was not a stranger. This was not some mysterious outsider who had appeared from nowhere. It was someone already woven into the edges of your world. Someone you had spoken to. Someone your soulmate knew. Someone everyone had been talking around without realizing they were standing at the center of the unanswered question. Yet discovering who only made the mystery deeper. Why would your son take on this responsibility for them? Why would he allow people to misunderstand him rather than reveal what this person had trusted him with? Why had he remained silent even when speaking would have made his own life easier? Those questions began to matter more than the secret itself. There are moments when another person's character becomes visible not through what they announce, but through what they quietly carry. Your soulmate began wondering whether this was one of those moments. Perhaps your son had understood something the adults around him had missed. Perhaps he had seen someone struggling to find the courage to explain themselves. Perhaps he believed one private promise mattered more than correcting every public assumption. And perhaps that is why your soulmate's feelings shifted from suspicion to something unexpectedly tender. They remembered every time your son could have defended himself but chose not to. Every opportunity he had to point toward the other person and say, "Ask them." He never did. That kind of restraint made the situation harder to dismiss. But there was another layer. Your soulmate noticed that whenever this person came near you, your son watched, not with distrust, but with concern. As though he were waiting to see whether they were finally going to say what needed to be said. The person he had protected seemed unaware of just how much your son had absorbed on their behalf. Or perhaps they knew perfectly well and simply had not found the right moment yet. Either possibility made your soulmate more curious. Then something happened that changed the atmosphere completely. Your soulmate and your son were alone for a few minutes, and the question finally came, not as an accusation, but as something quieter. You were protecting them, weren't you? Your son did not answer immediately. He looked away. There was no panic in his face. No attempt to invent an explanation. Just the expression of someone realizing that a truth had finally reached the surface without his permission. After several seconds, he said something your soulmate was not prepared for. Please don't make me explain why. Notice those words. He did not deny who. He asked them not to ask why. And in that single sentence, the entire mystery changed. Your soulmate now knew their instinct had been correct. The identity was no longer hidden. Yet somehow the most important part remained untouched. Why? What had this person told your son that made him feel responsible for protecting them? What had happened between them that made silence feel necessary? And why did your son seem less worried about himself than about what would happen if the reason became known too soon? Your soulmate could have pushed. They could have demanded an answer. Instead, something in your son's expression made them stop. There was a seriousness there, but not darkness. There was care. The kind that says, "This is not mine to reveal." And your soulmate did something nobody expected. They respected it. They simply nodded and said, "All right." Your son looked almost surprised. Because perhaps he had prepared himself for conflict. Perhaps he had believed discovery would force him to betray a promise. Instead, your soulmate gave him room. And that small decision created trust where suspicion had been living only moments earlier. Stay till the end, because this is where the story begins turning toward you. Until now, your soulmate had been trying to understand your son. But suddenly they began wondering whether you had been protected too. Could the silence have had something to do with preventing you from carrying a burden that was never meant to be yours? Could your son have known that telling you too early would place you in the middle of something another person still needed to resolve? Your soulmate could not prove it. But one memory returned with unusual clarity. There had been a day when you almost asked the exact question that would have exposed everything. Your son had changed the subject immediately. At the time it seemed almost rude. Now your soulmate wondered whether he had been trying to spare you from being placed in an impossible position. And suddenly the mystery felt less like a secret kept from you and more like a boundary held around you. That possibility touched something deep in your soulmate. They started thinking about the way people often misunderstand quiet loyalty. Sometimes the loudest person in the room looks honest simply because they explain everything. Meanwhile, the person carrying someone else's confidence looks suspicious because they refuse to speak. Yet silence does not always mean there is something wrong hiding underneath it. Sometimes silence means, "I gave my word." Sometimes it means, "This story belongs to someone else." Sometimes it means, I am waiting for the right person to tell it. Your soulmate began seeing your son through that lens. And the person he had been protecting? Their behavior began changing too. They seemed to realize that the situation could not remain suspended forever. Their conversations with your son became shorter. Their glances toward you became heavier with something unspoken. Twice, your soulmate noticed them begin to say something and then stop. That mattered. Because it suggested your son was not planning to carry this forever. He was waiting. Waiting for them. Waiting for a moment that belonged to them rather than to gossip, assumption, or pressure. Then came the smallest clue of all, and strangely, it may have been the most revealing. Your soulmate saw this person quietly thank your son. There was no explanation attached. Just a soft, sincere thank you that seemed far too meaningful for whatever ordinary conversation had surrounded it. Your son responded, "You don't owe me anything." But the person shook their head. "I do." Your soulmate heard those words and felt the final pieces settle into place. Yes, your son had been protecting this person. There was no question anymore. But why they needed protecting remained hidden behind a promise neither of them seemed willing to break prematurely. And now another possibility began emerging, one that your soulmate had not considered at all. What if the reason had nothing to do with wrongdoing? What if the secret everyone had treated like a looming revelation was actually something deeply personal, something vulnerable, perhaps even something hopeful that this person simply wanted to reveal in their own way? Your soulmate remembered how careful your son had been. Not frightened. Careful. That distinction became impossible to ignore. Fear makes people react. Care makes people choose. Your son had been choosing his words every step of the way. Choosing when to speak, when to remain silent, when to absorb misunderstanding, and when to gently redirect attention. Whatever the reason was, it mattered to him because the person mattered to him. Yet there was still one detail your soulmate could not explain. Why had your son looked toward you every single time this person's secret came close to being revealed? Why were you part of the equation even though nobody had mentioned you directly? That question remained in your soulmate's mind until later that evening, when your son said something almost casually that changed the direction of everything again. "I just wanted them to have the chance to tell you themselves." You. Not everyone. Not the family. You. In that moment, your soulmate understood that the unanswered reason somehow led directly back to you. Whatever this person had trusted your son with was not simply information they were keeping private. It was something they eventually intended for you to know. And suddenly your son's entire role became clearer. He was not building a wall between you and the truth. He was guarding the doorway until the person on the other side was ready to open it themselves. Something important is waiting for you, because your soulmate now knows who your son was protecting. Your son knows why. The person themselves knows that their moment to speak is approaching. But you remain at the center of a truth that has not yet been fully expressed. And perhaps the most surprising part is that nobody seems to be trying to hurt you with silence. They may have been trying to protect the meaning of the moment when the truth finally reaches you. Your soulmate can feel that now. That is why they have stopped searching for clues and started watching your son with new respect. They understand there are some answers you do not take from people. You allow them to give those answers when they are ready. Still, one question has not left their mind. Why did this person trust your son with something meant eventually for you? Of everyone they could have chosen, why him? There is an answer to that question. Your soulmate may already be closer to it than they realize. Because shortly after everything seemed to settle, the person your son had been protecting approached him again. This time, your soulmate noticed something different. Your son did not reassure them. He did not tell them to wait. He simply listened, and then asked one quiet question: "Are you ready to tell them now?" The person looked toward where you had been only moments earlier. They hesitated. Then they gave the smallest nod. And what they said next to your son was not the revelation itself, but it finally explained why your son had protected them for so long. There are moments when one quiet sentence changes the meaning of everything that came before it, and this was one of them. Your son stood there listening as the person he had protected finally admitted something your soulmate had never considered: "I wasn't afraid of them knowing. I was afraid they would misunderstand why I waited so long." Those words settled differently. They did not sound like someone hiding a terrible truth. They sounded like someone who had carried an important feeling carefully because they knew that once it was spoken, nothing would feel quite the same again. Your son did not interrupt. He seemed to understand exactly what they meant, almost as if they had discussed this moment many times before. And your soulmate, watching from a respectful distance, suddenly realized something extraordinary about the mystery they had been trying to solve. The reason had never been hidden because it was dangerous. It had been protected because it was delicate. There is a difference. A very important difference. Sometimes people rush toward answers believing the answer itself is what matters most, but there are truths whose meaning depends entirely on the moment in which they are revealed. Your son seemed to understand that before anyone else did. He had not simply promised to keep something quiet. He had promised to preserve the moment when this person would finally be able to speak for themselves. Don't skip what comes next, because your soulmate was about to understand why your son had allowed everyone, including them, to form the wrong conclusion for so long. The person lowered their voice and said, "If I tell them now, I need them to hear the whole thing. Not just the part everyone will notice first." Your son nodded. No surprise. No confusion. He already knew there was more than one layer to what was coming. And that was when your soulmate realized the question was no longer simply, what were they hiding? The deeper question became, what was everyone likely to misunderstand? Think about that for a second. There are moments in life when the first piece of information sounds completely different without the story behind it. One sentence can seem strange until you hear the 10 sentences that came before it. A decision can look confusing until you understand what someone was trying to protect. Your son apparently knew this. That was why he had remained so careful whenever conversations drifted near the subject. He was not trying to prevent you from knowing forever. He was trying to prevent you from knowing only half of it. And half a truth can create more confusion than silence. Your soulmate began remembering something your son had once said weeks earlier, long before anyone realized it mattered. Someone had been discussing how quickly people judge situations they do not fully understand, and your son had quietly remarked, sometimes the explanation matters more than the thing itself. Nobody had reacted. It sounded like an ordinary observation. Now your soulmate heard it differently. He had been living inside that sentence. Perhaps he had wanted to tell you countless times. Perhaps every time he saw you wondering, some part of him wished he could simply remove the uncertainty. But doing that would have meant breaking someone else's trust and giving you a fragment instead of the whole picture. Your soulmate began to see just how difficult that position must have been. Imagine knowing something that could resolve everyone's questions, yet also knowing it was not yours to reveal. Imagine hearing people misunderstand your silence and still choosing not to defend yourself because your defense would expose somebody else. Suddenly your son's behavior looked less mysterious and more mature than anyone had recognized. Something important is waiting for you here, because the person he protected was now ready to speak, but not immediately. They asked your son for one more thing. Can you be there when I tell them? Your son looked surprised for the first time. Why? The answer came slowly. Because you're the reason I finally understood that I don't need to be ashamed of waiting until I was ready. Your soulmate felt something shift inside them. There was no scandal hiding underneath this. No dramatic betrayal. What existed instead was a deeply human situation. Someone had needed time, your son had recognized that need, and rather than forcing them toward a conversation they were not prepared to have, he had protected their space. But still, something did not quite add up. Why you? Why was this revelation intended specifically for you? Why had your son watched you so carefully every time the subject came close? And why did the person seem more nervous about your reaction than anyone else's? Your soulmate began wondering if perhaps the answer involved a misunderstanding from much earlier, a moment you might not even remember clearly. And then, without warning, another piece surfaced. The person your son had protected mentioned a day from months ago. A day when you had unknowingly done something small that changed the way they saw themselves. You had not made a grand speech. You had not performed some unforgettable gesture. According to them, you had simply treated them with kindness at exactly the moment they expected to be judged. You probably did not remember it. They did. That single interaction stayed with them. They had wanted to explain what it meant ever since, but the longer they waited, the harder the conversation became. Isn't that strange? Sometimes the moments we forget become turning points in somebody else's story. A sentence you considered ordinary may become something another person carries for months. A little patience may remain in someone's memory long after you have moved on. Your son had discovered that this person was carrying something like that. And somehow, instead of exposing it, he became the one person willing to let them take their time. Your soulmate now understood another piece. Your son was not protecting them from you. He was protecting the sincerity of what they wanted to tell you. There is something deeply different about those two things. If he had spoken for them, the message might have sounded like gossip. If another person had discovered it, the entire situation might have become a conversation about speculation. Your son wanted you to hear it directly from the person whose life it had actually affected. And perhaps that is why he had been willing to endure being misunderstood. The truth deserved its own voice. Stay till the end, because even this was not the full reason. Your soulmate thought they finally understood everything, but then your son asked the person a question that revealed a second layer. Are you going to tell them what happened afterward too? The person went silent. Their expression changed, not with fear, but with emotion. Your soulmate immediately realized there was another piece. Something had happened after that moment of kindness. Something connected to why your son became involved. The person finally answered, "Yes. I think I have to." Your son nodded again. And then your soulmate heard the sentence that explained why your son had carried the burden so personally, "Because if you hadn't found me that day, I might never have understood what they were trying to show me." Your soulmate's thoughts stopped for a moment. Found them? What did that mean? Your son had not simply been told a secret. He had been there at a pivotal moment. Suddenly another memory surfaced. There had been an afternoon when your son arrived home later than expected. He had given a simple explanation: he had run into someone who needed to talk. Everyone accepted it. Nobody asked for details. Now your soulmate realized that afternoon may have been the beginning of everything. Your son had encountered this person somewhere unexpectedly. They had apparently been overwhelmed, not in danger, not in crisis, but emotionally uncertain about something they had been carrying. Your son listened. And during that conversation, they mentioned you. They told him about the moment you had shown them kindness. They explained how deeply it had stayed with them. They admitted they wanted to say something to you but did not know how to begin. Your son, according to what your soulmate was slowly understanding, had become the bridge between that old moment and this approaching conversation. Yet rather than carrying the message for them, he encouraged them to find the courage to carry it themselves. That was the why. Or at least part of it. He protected them because he had seen how sincere the feeling behind the secret was. He knew that if others started discussing it too soon, something private and meaningful might become distorted into something it was never meant to be. So whenever questions came, he took the attention instead. Whenever assumptions started, he refused to add fuel to them. Whenever the person worried they had waited too long, your son reminded them that honesty does not become meaningless simply because it takes time to find the right words. Your soulmate was beginning to feel something they had not expected when this mystery began: pride. Not because your son had hidden something. Secrecy for its own sake is not what mattered. It was the intention underneath his choices. He had recognized that trust sometimes means knowing when a story is not yours to tell. And now that story was preparing to step into the light on its own terms. But here is where everything shifted once more. Your soulmate finally asked your son privately, "Why did you care so much about protecting this?" He could have given a simple answer. He could have said because they were a friend, because they asked him to, because he gave his word. Instead, he looked at your soulmate for a long moment and said, because they were worried that once they told the truth, everyone would think they wanted something from them. Your soulmate understood immediately who "them" meant. You. This person had been afraid that sharing what your kindness meant might be interpreted as an attempt to gain your attention, your approval, or something else from you. They wanted nothing except for you to know that something you did had mattered. That was why your son guarded the story so carefully. He knew how easily sincere gratitude can be mistaken when too many people begin adding their own interpretations. He had heard this person say over and over, "I don't want them to feel responsible for me. I just want them to know they changed something." Suddenly the title of this entire situation changed in your soulmate's mind. This was no longer about your son hiding something. It was about your son protecting someone's chance to say thank you without having their intentions rewritten by everyone around them. And now your soulmate understood why he had always looked toward you. Because you were not the target of a secret. You were the destination of a message. Something important is waiting for you, and perhaps it is simpler than all the theories everyone created. The person wanted you to know that an ordinary act of compassion had reached farther than you realized. They wanted to explain how it changed a decision they made later. They wanted to tell you that when they eventually faced another difficult moment, they remembered the way you had treated them and chose to offer that same patience to someone else. What began with you had traveled forward. Your son had witnessed part of that ripple. And this is where the story became even more meaningful. The person told him that after your kindness helped them, they had quietly made a promise to themselves. When someone else eventually needed understanding, they would give what had once been given to them. Months later, that opportunity arrived. Another person came to them feeling uncertain and misunderstood, and instead of judging quickly, they listened. Your son happened to learn about it. He realized the connection. Your one forgotten moment of grace had become their act of grace towards someone else. That was the deeper reason your son believed the story belonged directly to you. It was not merely about what you did. It was about what your action became after it left your hands. Your soulmate felt the mystery soften into something almost beautiful. Everyone had been expecting a secret that would disrupt something. Instead, they were discovering a chain of quiet goodness nobody had seen forming. And your son had been protecting the chain until every person involved was ready to acknowledge it. Yet one question still remained. Why did the person hesitate for so long if the truth was this positive? The answer was more personal than your soulmate expected. They were not afraid you would react badly. They were afraid you would dismiss your own importance. They knew the kind of person who sometimes says, "It was nothing," when someone tells them they helped. They did not want you to wave away what the moment had meant. They wanted you to understand that what felt small to you had not been small to them. That is why they had rehearsed the conversation repeatedly. That is why your son knew so much. They kept asking him, "How do I make them understand without making it sound bigger than it was?" And your son kept answering, "Just tell them the truth." There is something powerful in that. You do not always need dramatic language to explain that someone mattered. Sometimes you simply tell them where you were, what they did, and what changed afterward. Your soulmate realized this person had been searching for exactly those words. And your son had refused to steal the moment by speaking first. But now the waiting was almost over. Later that day, your son walked into the room where your soulmate was sitting. He seemed calmer than he had been in weeks. "They're going to talk to them tomorrow," he said. Your soulmate knew exactly who both pronouns meant. "Are they ready?" Your son smiled slightly. "I think so." Then your soulmate asked something they had been wondering ever since this story began. "And after they tell them, is there anything else?" Your son's smile disappeared, not because something was wrong, but because that question had touched the one remaining secret. He looked toward the doorway and said, "There's one thing they still don't know." Your soulmate felt curiosity rise again. "Who?" Your son answered, "Both of them. Both of them." You and the person he had been protecting were about to enter a conversation believing the story went in one direction. But your son knew of another connection neither of you had discovered yet. A coincidence, perhaps. Or something that would make the entire story feel unexpectedly complete. Your soulmate wanted to ask immediately, but your son shook his head gently. This part isn't mine to tell either. That response almost made your soulmate laugh because by now it was exactly what they should have expected from him. Yet they could see from his expression that this final layer mattered. Not as a shock. Not as some overwhelming revelation. As a connection. Something that would explain why the person's path had crossed yours at precisely that moment months ago, and why your son later became involved without any of you planning it. The next morning arrived quietly. No dramatic atmosphere. No sense that anything extraordinary was about to happen. And perhaps that made it more meaningful. You were going about your ordinary routine when the person approached. Your son was nearby, just as they had requested. Your soulmate remained farther away, giving the conversation space while still understanding how much had led to this moment. The person said your name. You turned. They smiled nervously. Can I tell you something I should have told you a long time ago? You did not know what was coming. They began with the day you barely remembered. They explained where they had been emotionally. They told you the sentence you said. They described the kindness you offered without knowing they needed it. And slowly, you remembered. Maybe not every detail. Maybe not even the exact words. But you remembered them. Then they told you what happened afterward. How they carried your kindness forward. How it affected the way they treated another person months later. How your son eventually learned what had happened. And why he agreed to protect the story until they could tell you themselves. Your soulmate watched your face carefully. There was no disappointment there. No frustration over having been kept outside the story. There was something quieter, realization. You finally understood why your son had seemed distant whenever those conversations arose. He had never been pulling away from you. In a strange way, he had been preserving something for you. But the conversation was not finished. Remember, your son still knew something both of you did not. The person took a breath and said, "There's another reason I wanted to tell you today." Your son looked toward your soulmate. That was the signal. This was the final layer he had refused to reveal. The person continued, "The person I helped afterward, the one I told you about, I didn't know until yesterday that you know them too." Your expression changed. Your soulmate leaned forward slightly. Suddenly all those separate moments were about to connect. The kindness you gave had traveled through this person towards someone else, and that someone was already part of your world. Not a stranger. Not someone far away. Someone whose recent change in behavior you had noticed without understanding where it came from. Someone who had become calmer, more hopeful, more willing to reconnect. Your son knew. Your soulmate was only beginning to understand. And then the person finally said the name. For several seconds, nobody spoke. Because in that instant, you realized that something you had given away without expecting anything in return had somehow found its way back towards someone you cared about. Your son had not been protecting one person after all. In his own quiet way, he had been protecting a circle of people, including you, until everyone could see the whole story instead of only one piece. Yet as meaningful as that realization was, your soulmate noticed one final thing. When the name was spoken, your son did not look relieved. He looked thoughtful. Almost as though there were still one piece he had not expected anyone to uncover that day. And when you turned toward him and asked, "How long have you known all of this?" his answer opened an entirely new door. Longer than you think, because that isn't actually where the story started.